Now that we've got our environment set up, we can actually start to code. Now you might be thinking, uh-oh, here comes the hard stuff. But actually, in my experience, the hardest part is setting up the environment. The coding itself is not necessarily difficult. So don't panic, there won't be anything here that you won't be able to do. We will be taking this step by step, so if you feel like you're falling behind or you've missed something, you can just rewind the video. We're going to get started by running npm start if it isn't already running from the last episode. So when it's finished loading, we'll be back where we left off. Now what I want you to do is right click anywhere in the window and click the inspect button. That will open up our console. The console is a very helpful tool for developers and will help us see what we're building as we're building it. Now if you make sure you're on the Elements tab and then click this button, we can inspect everything that is in our page. Now if we click up here on this Hello World, we can see the div from last episode. Now let's go into VS Code again, and in between these two div tags, let's write another div. And then press Ctrl S or File, Save. If we go back to the browser, we'll see the second one. Again, we can click this little arrow. Now all websites are just made up of lots of different divs, which essentially means that all websites are just made up of lots of boxes. So you've probably noticed that the website is looking really bland at the moment, and that's because we haven't added any styling yet. You can add flair to your website with something called CSS. So if we go back to VS Code, we want to now look at the file called app.css. Now in here there's quite a few things left over from the template, but we can get rid of most of it. So if we go from line 4 down, and then press the delete key, we'll be left with just this. Right, so what is this? This is called a class, and you apply it to div elements. Let's go back to app.tsx, and we'll see that on this div we've got class name app. Let's go back to the CSS. This is called app. So what this is doing is saying any div that has this class will have these styles applied. The only style that's in there right now is text-align center. So let's go back to the web browser and check that out. If we click up here to inspect the elements and hover over Hello World, you'll notice that the blue box is the div, and the text is horizontally aligned in the center. Now the stylings can do a lot more than just centering text. Let's go back to VS Code, enter a new line and type in background dash color, and we'll use red. Now you have to end every line with a semicolon. If you save that, you'll see that the background is now red. If we go back to VS Code, let's try something else. We just do color and say white, and ending with a semicolon. Save that, the text is white. Let's go back to app.tsx. Let's remove this first Hello World. We'll replace the text here, copy this line, and add 3 more of them. Now let's try adding separate classes for each one. Let's save this and see what happens. If we look to the console on the right, we can see that those classes have been applied. But right now they're not doing anything. That's because we haven't defined the classes yet. So let's go back into VS Code, open app.css, and make some new classes. Classes always start with a full stop followed by the name, and then open and close brackets. Now anything inside those brackets are your styles. So for class 1 we want to give it a background color of green. Now let's do the same for the other 3. Except we'll change the color for each class. So this is looking a bit more colorful. you notice that we've got these rows one after each other, and that's the default behavior of divs. A div by default will take up 100% of the width of its container, and one by one they'll fall below each other. So let's go back to VS Code and play around with the styles some more. Let's first get rid of this background color on the class app. Go into class 1 and add a width of 50%. Save that and see what happens. Now notice that it does exactly what it says, it takes up 50% of the width now. Let's go to class 2 and add width 75%. Now there's a huge amount of things that we can do with the CSS, and I really encourage you to play around with these classes as much as you can to see what you can get them to do. For example, let's try something else. On class 4, let's add a margin of 10 pixels. Now that's added a bit of space between itself and the things around it. Similar to the margin style is the padding style. So if we add a padding of 10 pixels, padding will add space between itself and its contents, almost like a frame for the div. So now let's try and get these 4 divs to line up left to right rather than top to bottom. So let's get rid of the extra stylings that we've just added. One of the ways to tell a div not to take up the entire row is to assign the value float, and we're going to assign float left. Now if we apply this to every one of our classes, we'll see them sitting from left to right rather than top to bottom. Now if we want them to take up the entire row, since there's 4 of them, we'll add a width of 25% to each. So because we've assigned the width as a percentage, when we change the screen size, the divs will change their size too. If we don't want the div to take up a percentage of the screen, we can set a fixed value. So instead of 25% of the screen, we can say take up 100 pixels. For this one, if we say take up 200 pixels, this one 3, this one 5. Now if we go back to the web page, you'll notice that 4 here is wrapped onto the second line. That's because there's not enough room here to fit 500 pixels. If we increase the space, it'll jump back up. As we reduce it, it'll flip to the next row. So now let's try and put the 1 and 2 on the left and the 3 and 4 on the right. First we'll reduce the width of the 4 class so they can fit on one line. And then what we're going to do, as you might have guessed, is set the float of these 2 to right. Now that will tell the divs to stick to the right side of the screen rather than the left. Now you notice that now it says 1, 2, 4, 3. And the reason for that is the order of the divs. So here we're saying float left, float left, float right, float right. But you'll see that this is the first div to be told to float right, therefore is the rightmost div. So to amend that, we'll have to go into our code, go back to the TSX, and flip these 2 around. Now let's try adding a 5th div and put it to the bottom of the screen. So what we can do for convenience is copy this div, change the class to 5, and then we'll have to make that class. So if we check out the web browser, when we go to the web page, you'll notice that we can't even see 5 on the screen. And that's because 5 is what we call a child of this div. So a child is anything that exists within the opening and closing tags. So within this div, we have 5 children. Within this div, we have 1 child, which is the text 1. So a child will receive the styles of the parent div. So that's why 1, 2, 3, 4 all have white text. Because the app class says the color is white, and that applies to all of the children. Now this can be overwritten. A div will always take the styles of its closest class first. So here if we change the color to black, the text color of 1 will become black because the class 1 is closer applied than the app class. So now let's go back to app.css and we'll change the color of 5 to black so that we can see it. Now that we're able to see the text, I've noticed that I've called it 3 rather than 5. So let's quickly change that. So now you can see that 5 has naturally slotted itself in the available slot. But what's actually happening, because we haven't assigned a float value, is that 5, unlike the others, is taking up the entire row. But this isn't at all what we wanted. So the first thing we need to do to get 5 to sit at the bottom of the page is to increase the size of this div, because right now it's really thin. So we can change the app class to have a height of 100 VH, and VH stands for view height. Now the view is the browser window, meaning we're taking up 100% of the browser window's height. We're also going to have to apply a position style of relative. This will allow us to make the contents a bit more flexible. If we go to our 5 class, we can now enter position, absolute, bottom, 0 pixels. Now what that's saying is that the 5 div will now sit 0 pixels from the bottom of its parent. So if you save it, you can see the 5 div has now gone to the bottom of the screen. Let's add a background color so we can see it more clearly. And you'll notice that the 5 div is now tucked away at the corner of the page and is really small. And now that it's position absolute, it won't take anything for granted and it will only do what we tell it to. So what we're going to tell it to do is to be width 100%. So we've just scratched the surface on what CSS and HTML can do to a web page. There's a huge amount of possibility with CSS. And you won't be able to learn even just 10% of it through watching tutorial videos. What you're going to want to do is just go at it yourself, play around, see what happens when you do this, that and the other. If you're looking for some inspiration, VS Code will help us. By pressing Ctrl and the spacebar, it will come up with a lot of suggestions. Play around with these values and see what happens. If at any point you see some weird error messages on your screen, it's probably because you've got a typo in your code. So for example, if I take away this semicolon and try to save that, it will break. Don't worry, add the semicolon back in, save again, it will refresh. Now to begin with, this might happen quite a lot because you're not familiar with what the code is supposed to look like. Don't be put off by this, because developers have to deal with this every single day. HTML and CSS are the building blocks of websites, and if you play around with the CSS now enough to become comfortable with it, you'll be getting yourself in a really good position. So that will draw this episode to a close. We're not going to continue using what we've made here, so feel free to play around with it as much as you like. On the next episode, we'll teach you what you need to know about data types.